Alexandra stood alone near the marble bar of the elite lounge, her hands trembling slightly as she adjusted the torn edge of her midnight blue gown. The music thumped softly around her crystal chandeliers, reflecting off gold-trimmed mirrors. She had never felt more out of place in her life. The women around her laughed easily, their dresses glittering, their voices sharp with entitlement. Alexandra had come here only to distract herself, only to breathe, only to exist for one quiet hour without being judged. She had chosen simplicity, elegance, restraint. Things she believed spoke louder than labels. But tonight, restraint felt like weakness, because the moment she stepped inside, their eyes had found her three women draped in designer silk. An arrogance, their laughter cutting through the air as they watched her from across the room. Alexandra felt it before she heard it, the judgment. The assumption that she did not belong here, that she was pretending, that she was an imposter. The first woman, tall blonde lips, tight with disdain, whispered something into the ear of the second, a brunette with diamonds at her throat. The third, a redhead with cold, calculating eyes, smiled slowly like a predator spotting prey. Alexandra tried to ignore them. She ordered sparkling water instead of champagne. She held her clutch tightly. She told herself she did not need approval. She had survived worse. She had survived loneliness, misunderstandings, and nights where the world felt heavier than her heart. But then heels clicked closer. Laughter followed, and suddenly they were there, surrounding her space. Shrinking, the blonde spoke first, her voice dripping with mockery, saying she loved costume jewelry and asking Alexandra where she rented her dress. The brunette laughed openly, eyes scanning Alexandra from head to toe, commenting that the lounge must be letting anyone in these days. Alexandra felt heat rise to her cheeks, but she said nothing. She had learned silence was safer. The redhead leaned closer, her perfume overwhelming, and asked sweetly if Alexandra was waiting for someone important, or if she had wandered in by mistake. The laughter grew louder, heads turned. Alexandra felt hundreds of eyes on her, judging, weighing, deciding. She was less. She took a breath. She whispered that she just wanted to enjoy a drink, that she meant no trouble. That was when the blonde reached out, fingers sharp and quick, and pulled the delicate fabric of Alexandra's gown. The sound of tearing cloth was louder than the music. Gasps filled the room. The gown split along the side, revealing skin, vulnerability, humiliation. Alexandra froze, shock paralyzing her body. The brunette covered her mouth, pretending surprise while smiling. The redhead stepped back, raising her hands innocently, saying, "Oops, accidents happen, don't they?" Alexandra wanted to disappear. She wanted the floor to open and swallow. Her whole tears burned her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She would not give them that satisfaction. Whispers spread, phones lifted. Some recorded, some laughed, some looked away. The manager hesitated, torn between wealth and decency. Security stood still, uncertain. The blonde shrugged and said, "Maybe next time, learn how to dress for places like this." Alexandra wrapped her arms around herself, trying to cover the tear, trying to hold herself together. Her heart pounding, her chest tight. She thought of leaving, running away again like she always did when the world turned cruel. But then something shifted. The air changed. The doors of the lounge opened, and silence rippled outward like a wave. Footsteps echoed, heavy, confident, deliberate. A man entered, tall, broad shoulders, tailored black suit, presence undeniable. Conversations died, heads turned instinctively toward power. The women stiffened, recognition flickering across their faces, fear replacing amusement. The man scanned the room, his eyes sharp, searching, and then they found her. Alexandra, standing, broken, humiliated, trembling. His expression changed instantly. Concern, rage, protectiveness, all colliding in a single breath. He crossed the room in long strides. People partying for him, whispers igniting his name, spoken in disbelief. Xavier Steele, the billionaire, the phantom investor, the man whose face rarely appeared in public, but whose influence shaped cities, markets, lives. Alexandra felt his presence before she saw him, the familiar gravity, the warmth that always grounded her. She lifted her eyes, meeting his gaze. Relief crashed over her like a storm. Xavier stopped in front of her without a word. He removed his jacket, gently draping it over her shoulders, shielding her from every stare. His hand touched her cheek softly, asking if she was hurt. If they had touched her, she shook. Her head, unable to speak, tears finally escaping. Xavier turned slowly, then facing the three women, his eyes dark cold. Deadly quiet, the blonde tried to laugh it off, saying it was just a misunderstanding. Just a little joke, but Xavier raised one hand. And the room fell completely silent, his voice calm, controlled, dangerous. He asked, "Who did this?" No one answered. The brunette avoided his gaze. The redhead stepped back, but Xavier already knew. Security moved instantly. Now alert managers rushed forward, apologizing, sweating, but Xavier ignored them, his attention fixed on the women who moments ago felt untouchable. He spoke again, stating that Alexandra was his wife, his partner, the woman he loved more than his empire. Shock exploded across the lounge. Jaws dropped, phones shook, hands trembled, the blonde went pale. The brunette stammered, the redhead eyes widened with terror, because they understood in that moment that they had not humiliated an ordinary woman. They had attacked the wife of a man who owned the ground beneath their feet and the future in his hands. Xavier took out his phone, made a single call, his voice low, precise. Within minutes, consequences began to unfold: accounts, frozen partnerships, dissolved invitations, revoked names, erased from guest lists. The women begged, apologizing, crying, offering money, excuses, anything but. Xavier looked at Alexandra, asking quietly what she wanted, because he would honor her choice completely. The room held its breath, waiting to see whether mercy or justice would fall, and Alexandra stood there wrapped in his jacket, no longer small, no longer invisible, realizing for the first time that power was not in wealth or cruelty, but in knowing who you were and who stood beside you, and this was only the beginning. Alexandra felt the weight of the room shift, as if gravity itself had bent toward her. Every whisper, every stare, every held breath now waiting for her reaction. Moments ago, she had been the smallest presence in the lounge. Now she stood at the center of its attention, wrapped in Xavier's jacket, warmth and strength surrounding her. The three women who had mocked her now stood trembling. Their confidence evaporated like smoke. The blonde who had torn her gown tried to step forward, her voice cracking, as she said she was sorry, that she did not know, that it was a misunderstanding, that she had too much to drink. The brunette nodded quickly, tears streaming, mascara smudging down her face, repeating apologies, promising to pay for the dress, for the humiliation, for anything Alexandra wanted. The redhead dropped to her knees, sobbing openly, clutching at the hem of Alexandra's gown, begging for forgiveness, saying she would do anything, anything at all. Alexandra looked down at them, her heart pounding, not with triumph, but with a strange calm. She remembered all the moments in her life when people had decided she was nothing, when silence had been her shield and endurance her only weapon. She remembered cleaning small apartments, studying late nights, believing kindness still mattered even when it hurt. Now power stood beside her, waiting to be guided, not demanding, but offering. Xavier leaned closer. His voice meant only for her, telling her that whatever she chose would stand, that he trusted her completely, that she never had to be small again. Alexandra closed her eyes for a moment, breathing deeply. Letting the noise fade, she opened them again and looked at the women, not with anger, but with clarity. She asked them quietly why they had done it, why tearing another woman down felt entertaining, why cruelty came so easily when they believed no consequences would follow. The blonde could not answer. The brunette whispered something about status and image and competition. The redhead sobbed that she had always been afraid of being irrelevant. Alexandra nodded, slowly understanding more than she wished to. She turned to Xavier and told him she did not want them ruined forever. She wanted them to remember this moment every time they judged someone. She wanted them to face consequences that taught, not destroyed. Xavier studied her pride, softening his expression. He respected her restraint, her strength, her compassion. Even now he turned to his team, instructing them calmly. The women would be escorted out, banned from the lounge, from every establishment under his ownership, their names removed from exclusive boards, charities, and events they valued so much, their influence would shrink, their reputations question not. Through lies but through truth, security moved immediately, helping them up, guiding them away, their pleas echoing behind them as the doors closed. Silence followed, then murmurs, admiration, disbelief, awe. Someone began to clap slowly, others joined. Until the sound filled the lounge, Alexandra felt overwhelmed. She had never sought applause. Xavier placed a hand on her back, guiding her gently toward the exit, shielding her from cameras and questions. Outside, the night air was cool, grounding. She leaned against him, finally allowing herself to cry, not from weakness, but release. He held her tightly, murmuring that she was safe, that she was extraordinary, that the world would never overlook her again. They left together, stepping into the waiting car, headlights cutting through the darkness as the lounge faded behind them. But inside that building, stories would be told, rumors spread, legends born about the night. An ordinary woman revealed she was anything but, and as the car pulled away, Alexandra looked out the window, realizing something profound. She did not need revenge to feel powerful. She only needed truth, dignity, and the courage to stand, and beside her sat a man who knew her worth even when the world tried to forget it. And this realization marked the true beginning of a story far bigger than humiliation, far deeper than wealth, a story of choice, identity, and the quiet, unstoppable rise of a woman who would never be underestimated again. The next morning, sunlight spilled through the tall windows of the penthouse, painting the city in gold. Alexandra stood wrapped in a robe, holding a cup of tea, her mind replaying the night again and again, not the cruelty, but the moment she chose herself. Xavier watched her quietly from across the room, knowing she needed space, knowing strength often arrived in silence. News was already spreading, headlines whispered about an incident at an elite lounge, speculation swirled about the identity of the woman who stood beside Xavier Steele. Some praised her grace, others tried to dig into her past, but Alexandra felt strangely calm. She had lived without approval for so long that noise no longer frightened her. Xavier approached gently, telling her that the women from the lounge had already begun to feel the shift. Invitations, canceled partnerships, paused social doors quietly closed, not because of vengeance, but because influence had memory. Alexandra nodded, understanding that power once revealed could never be unseen. She told Xavier she did not want to hide anymore. She was tired of shrinking. He smiled, proud, telling her she never had to hide again, that if she wished, the world would meet her on her terms. Together, they stepped onto the balcony overlooking the city. The same city that once ignored her, now buzzing with her name. Alexandra inhaled deeply, feeling something new settle in her chest. Not anger, not fear, but ownership of her own story. And as the wind carried the distant sounds of life below, she knew this was only the first chapter of a much larger journey, one where she would decide who deserved her kindness and who would never again mistake her silence for weakness. Days passed, and the city adjusted to the truth. Alexandra Steele was no longer a rumor. She appeared quietly at charity events beside Xavier. Not overdressed, not seeking attention, yet impossible to ignore. Cameras followed her movements. Analysts spoke about her poise, her restraint, her calm authority. People who once dismissed her now leaned forward, listening. When she spoke, Alexandra began involving herself in foundations, education, shelters, women support initiatives, not as a figurehead, but as someone who understood invisibility. Boardrooms fell silent when she shared ideas, not because of Xavier's name, but because of her clarity. Meanwhile, the three women from the lounge watched their worlds shrink, calls unanswered, doors closed, smiles replaced by polite distance. They felt the weight of their own actions without Alexandra ever speaking their names. One evening, as Alexandra prepared for another event, she paused, looking at her reflection, no longer seeing the woman whose gown had been torn, but someone whole, someone grounded, someone unafraid. She realized the greatest consequence was not what happened to others, but what awakened inside her. And with that knowledge, she stepped forward, ready for whatever came next, knowing she would never again be defined by how others tried to break her. One quiet evening, Alexandra returned. Alone to the same lounge, not for confrontation, not for closure, but for herself. The staff recognized her instantly respect. Replacing hesitation, the space felt different, smaller, less intimidating. She sat at. The bar ordered sparkling water again and smiled softly, remembering how fear once lived in her chest, now replaced by calm certainty. No one mocked, no one stared. The room simply existed around her as an equal across the city. The women who once laughed now lived with the echo of that night, learning slowly that power without kindness collapses. Alexandra finished her drink, stood tall and walked out into the night, not looking back, understanding at last that she did not need protection. To be powerful, she had already become the woman the world could no longer tear apart as weeks turned into months. Alexandra, life transformed in ways she had never imagined, yet felt strangely natural. Invitations arrived from global forums, cultural summits, philanthropic councils. People wanted to know her thoughts, her values, her vision. She accepted, selectively choosing rooms where her voice could matter rather than glitter for show. Xavier remained beside her, never overshadowing, never controlling. Simply steady support. The media tried to label her the mysterious wife, the quiet force, the woman behind the empire, but Alexandra refused boxes. She spoke openly about dignity, about how isolated society equated worth with appearance, how cruelty often hid behind laughter and privilege. Her words resonated especially with women who had been overlooked, underestimated, erased. Letters poured in, stories of humiliation, survival, resilience. Alexandra read them late at night, responding when she could, reminding each sender that strength did not require wealth, only self-belief. Meanwhile, the three women from the lounge struggled publicly and privately. One marriage fractured under pressure, another business collapsed without alliances, the third retreated from society altogether. None of this brought Alexandra joy or guilt. It simply existed as consequence. One evening, she stood in her private study, overlooking the city lights, reflecting on how a single torn dress had unraveled illusions, revealed truths, and ignited a purpose she never knew she carried. She realized that her journey was no longer about revenge or validation, but about presence, about standing fully in the world without apology. And as she closed the curtains, she understood that her story was still unfolding, shaped not by what had been done to her, but by what she chose to build next. The following season brought challenges that tested Alexandra in quieter ways, not through cruelty, but through expectation. People now assumed perfection, assumed endless grace, assumed she would always forgive, always rise above. Some sought her favor, others her endorsement. Some tried to provoke her, hoping to borrow her spotlight. Alexandra learned discernment. She learned that kindness did not require access, and forgiveness did not require proximity. She began mentoring young women, privately, listening more than speaking, guiding without imposing. Xavier watched her growth with admiration, seeing how adversity had refined, rather than hardened her. One afternoon, they visited a small community center far from cameras, where Alexandra spoke with girls who reminded her of herself, uncertain, bright, unseen. As she left, one girl hugged her tightly, whispering that she felt braver just listening to her. Alexandra smiled, knowing then that the true impact of that night was not fear or fame, but the quiet courage passed from one heart to another. And with that understanding, she stepped forward into the next chapter, steady, unbreakable, and finally fully herself. Time moved gently now, no longer rushing, no longer heavy. Alexandra found rhythm in her days. Mornings spent reading, planning, listening. Afternoons filled with meetings that mattered. Evenings quiet with Xavier, where words were optional and understanding effortless. Yet the past still surfaced, sometimes in dreams, in reflections, in sudden memories of tearing fabric and laughter. But those moments no longer carried pain. They carried proof of distance traveled. One afternoon, an invitation arrived, handwritten, unexpected, from a university, requesting Alexandra to speak not about wealth, not about power, but about dignity. She hesitated, then accepted, standing weeks later in a simple hall before hundreds of students. She spoke of silence and choice, of how moments that break you can also introduce you to yourself. The room listened, not because of her name, but because of her truth. After the speech, a young woman approached, shaking, saying she had been bullied for years and that Alexandra's story gave her permission to stay standing. Alexandra held her hands and told her she had always been standing, even when the world tried to push her down. That night, driving home, Alexandra rested her head against the window, city lights blurring softly, realizing that her life was no longer defined by one dramatic night, but by countless quiet moments of connection. And as the car moved forward, felt no need to look back, knowing the woman who once stood alone at a bar had become someone who could light the way for others simply by being herself. As another year unfolded, Alexandra's influence deepened beyond headlines. Beyond rooms filled with power, she began writing quietly late at night. Not a memoir, not a confession, but reflections. Stories of ordinary moments where courage whispered instead of shouted. Xavier encouraged her, never rushing, never steering, trusting her instincts. When the writings were shared anonymously, they spread quickly because people recognized themselves in the words. Teachers, nurses, students, mothers, men and women who had been made to feel small found strength between the lines. Alexandra watched from a distance, humbled, understanding that visibility was not always physical. Sometimes it was simply being understood. One evening, she and Xavier walked through the city unnoticed. No cameras, no titles. Just two people moving through streets, once intimidating, now familiar. She passed a boutique window and caught her reflection, smiling softly, seeing not wealth, not status, but peace. She thought of the night her gown was torn and realized that moment no longer lived in her as a wound, but as a doorway she had walked through and closed. Behind her, the world had not become kinder, but she had become stronger, wiser, clearer, and that made all the difference. As they continued walking hand in hand, Alexandra knew that whatever challenges waited ahead, she would meet them standing grounded and unafraid, because she no longer needed proof of her worth. She carried it quietly within her. Every step of the way, spring arrived, and with it new opportunities. Alexandra found herself invited to international summits where leaders discussed education, innovation, philanthropy. She moved through the rooms not as a passive observer, but as a voice that carried weight, not because of Xavier's name, but because of her insight, because she had lived in visibility and humiliation and emerged with clarity. She spoke of empathy as strategy, of listening as power, of resilience as a tool for transformation. People leaned in, surprised at the depth in someone they had once dismissed as mere accessory. She returned home one evening, exhausted but invigorated. Xavier waiting with quiet dinner, candles flickering shadows across the walls. He asked her what she wanted to do next, and she paused, thinking not of revenge, not of proving herself, but of creating spaces where no one would feel invisible again. She shared her plan for scholarships, mentoring programs, safe havens for those underestimated. She saw in their faces the same spark she once carried alone, and he nodded, quietly proud, because he understood that the night at the lounge had been only a spark. The fire had grown inside her, and now it burned steady, unwavering, illuminating paths for others, not with spectacle, but with presence. As the city lights twinkled beyond their balcony, Alexandra felt a profound sense of completion, not of ending, but of continuity, knowing that every choice she made now was a seed for someone else. She smiled softly at Xavier, understanding that life had given her more than revenge, more than recognition. It had given her purpose and the strength to wield it with grace and courage in every quiet or public moment. Summer brought long evenings filled with golden light and quiet reflection. Alexandra often walked through gardens and along riversides, thinking about how far she had come, how small humiliations had shaped resilience, how whispered judgments had forged clarity. She noticed the world differently now, not in terms of who wielded power or who looked down, but in the subtleties of kindness, the unspoken ways people lifted each other without notice. She began hosting intimate gatherings at her Penthouse, not for prestige, but for conversation, for exchange of ideas, for creating networks of support and understanding. Those who attended left inspired not because of grandeur, but because they felt seen. Alexandra saw herself reflected in each story, in each person she met, recalling her own journey from invisibility to presence. She spoke candidly about boundaries, about knowing when to act and when to observe, about understanding that control over one's life is not dominance, but discernment. Xavier stood by her, always quietly present, his hand occasionally brushing hers. A reminder that partnership could be strength. Without overshadowing, one evening, as they watched the sunset over the skyline, Alexandra reflected on the night at the lounge and smiled softly. It no longer held anger, only perspective. She had discovered that power without humility is empty, and vengeance without thought is fleeting. She had learned that true influence was measured in the lives uplifted, in the courage instilled in others, and as night settled over the city, Alexandra knew that she had become the woman who once only dreamed of standing tall, a woman whose presence alone could shift the course of moments, and that realization filled her with a quiet, unshakable satisfaction. As autumn arrived, the city seemed to change color and pace. Alexandra found herself reflecting more deeply on the journey from the night her gown was torn to the life she now led. Each day brought opportunities to touch lives subtly, to make choices that created ripples beyond immediate perception. She began collaborating with organizations focused on empowering women in business, education, and creative fields. Not for publicity, but for genuine transformation. She mentored quietly, sharing lessons learned from humiliation, patience, and perseverance, stories of standing firm when no one was watching or believing. She traveled occasionally to small towns to speak to communities that rarely saw success stories like hers, and each time she returned home feeling the quiet fulfillment of impact that could not be measured in wealth or fame. Xavier continued his own work, yet always made space for her presence, for her input, for the shared vision they cultivated. Together, the night at the lounge had become almost mythic in her memory, a reference point rather than a wound, a reminder that even moments meant to diminish could catalyze growth. Alexandra found herself revisiting that memory, sometimes with amusement, sometimes with awe, realizing how dramatically life can pivot in a single moment. She no longer feared judgment nor sought permission. Instead, she built steadily, thoughtfully, and with an understanding that the true measure of power is not in being feared or envied, but in the capacity to create strength, confidence, and dignity in oneself and others. And as she watched leaves falling outside her window, she smiled, knowing that the lessons of the past were fully integrated into her present and future, and that no act of cruelty could ever again define her identity or limit her trajectory. Winter arrived with quiet stillness, snow dusting the rooftops and streets of the city. Alexandra found herself savoring calm mornings with Xavier, sipping coffee, watching the city wake. The season brought reflection and planning. She revisited projects begun earlier in the year, refining ideas, mentoring young women entrepreneurs, supporting educational initiatives that empowered those often overlooked. She traveled selectively, attending forums not for attention but for impact. Her presence in every room carried the authority of someone who had endured invisibility and emerged with clarity and compassion. Meanwhile, the memory of the lounge incident remained as a faint echo, no longer sharp or painful, but a marker of transformation. She often shared lessons from that night in speeches and private conversations, emphasizing resilience, integrity, and dignity. She noticed subtle changes around her, the world responding not to her wealth but to her insight, her empathy, her ability to hold power lightly yet firmly. Xavier continued to stand beside her, a constant reminder that partnership is measured not by control but by understanding. And as she looked out over the snowy skyline, she reflected on the arc of her journey, from humiliation to empowerment, from doubt to self-assurance, and knew that the path ahead was filled with opportunities to uplift, inspire, and lead with grace and quiet strength. Spring returned, bringing warmth and light, and with it, Alexandra felt a profound sense of completion. She and Xavier walked together through a blooming garden. A space they had discovered months before now, filled with new flowers and the quiet hum of life. The world around them moved on as it always did, but Alexandra noticed something different in herself. A stillness, a confidence, an understanding that every trial, humiliation, and act of cruelty had shaped not bitterness but clarity. And strength. She remembered the lounge, the torn gown, the laughter, the fear, and realized that night had been a turning point, not a wound to carry, but a doorway. She had walked through into her own power. She turned to Xavier and whispered that she was ready for whatever came next, not because she needed protection or validation, but because she had learned the ultimate truth, that the measure of a person is not in the judgment they face, but in the courage they hold when no one is watching. He smiled, holding her hand, saying that he had always known that she was extraordinary. Together, they looked out over the city's skyline, the lights twinkling like stars, mirroring the spark in her eyes. Alexandra finally understood that revenge had never been the goal, that dignity and self-belief were the true triumphs she had transformed. Fear into confidence, humiliation into perspective, invisibility into presence. And as the sunset casting golden light across the horizon, she stepped forward into her life, fully seen, fully alive, and completely free. A life where no one could ever underestimate her again, and with Xavier by her side. She knew this was the perfect ending to the chapter she had lived, and the perfect beginning of everything yet to come.